Good morning. I'm sure you've all heard the phrase, absence makes the heart grow fonder. And since we all know we've been away from Matthew's preaching for a while, we can't wait to hear that sermon about the hockey team climbing a mountain. But in seriousness, I know we'll all be fond to have Matthew back next week. This morning, I want to talk to you about acceptance. Oh, I have the clicker. Maybe. Acceptance is a critical part of human nature. It's critically important throughout life and during key phases and different stages in development. Dr. Harry Maslow created this hierarchy of needs, and he was a psychology professor at Columbia University. And he ranks it third in order of human development, only behind physiological needs such as food, water, and shelter. And throughout life, we see how influential and important the need to feel accepted can be. Children who don't get acknowledged and accepted and praised for doing good things will often rebel and get in trouble because they get accepted and acknowledged and attention that way. Adolescents can become so engrossed in their peers and the pressure of being accepted that they would rather make a poor decision in life and rather than losing their friends. We look at groups and societies that are considered outcasts, such as gangs, and we think, how could they live like that? But what they're ultimately gaining is acceptance. And they're accepted for who they are and the choices they make in that group. Think about if you were in a bad job or a hard work environment. You can put up with it if you enjoy the people you work with. But it is really hard to do a job where nobody wants you around, where nobody accepts you, where everyone belittles you and condemns you. Clearly, there is an instinct within us and a need that seeks this acceptance. You think about our congregation here at Castle Rock. It is so much ingrained in this body here that the elders have put it in the 3 B's, to belong. It's in our motto, to become a part of, to be accepted here in the Castle Rock congregation. Acceptance is valuable, it's necessary, it's needed. In Matthew 26, verse 26 through 32, we read about the institution of the Lord's Supper. And it seems that Jesus has accepted his fate, that he knows what he's going to do, and he has accepted where he's going with his life, what's going to happen to him. He knows he's going to die. He knows he's going to be sacrificed. And it seems that he has no trouble accepting this. It seems that it's just part of him. It appears very easy. And we read this passage as well as others and just kind of gloss over it. He accepted his cup. The whole point of his ministry was to be the sacrificial lamb. We read passages like Philippians 2 or John 3:16. Throughout his ministry, he talks about going to prepare a place, and where I go, you cannot follow, but you will be with me in my kingdom. He talks about being hated by the world because the world first hated me. He talks about the Son of Man will be handed over and crucified and raised on the 3rd day. Passage after passage, verse after verse, we hear Jesus talk about his cup and what he must do. And all the while he's talking about it, it's his acceptance of it. It seems that it's just a part of who he is, that he's really accepted it. He's really embraced it. He knows what he's come and gone to do. And the whole time you see the reverse in his apostles. The apostles are struggling and wrestling with it. Poor Peter makes the great confession, and then a little bit later when Jesus starts talking about his sacrifice, Peter's like, no, never. And Jesus calls him Satan, get behind me. And then later, when the institution of the Lord's Supper happens, you see Peter again say, Jesus says, the shepherd will be struck down and the sheep will scatter. And Peter says, never, I will never leave you. I'll never abandon you. And Jesus looks at him and says, Peter, 3 times you will deny me. There's this role reversal where the apostles are refusing to accept what Jesus is about to do. But it's like Jesus has already accepted it. But let us take a closer look in Matthew 26, 36 through 46. And in parallel passage to this, Mark 14, 32 through 42 say the same thing. Luke 20, 39 through 46 say the same thing. And John 18, verse 1 talks about this same passage. The fact that this is brought up in all four Gospels, it's probably a pretty big deal. It's probably pretty impactful and influential into our faith, into what God is trying to tell us, into a moment of understanding Jesus and what he is doing. You just have the institution of the Lord's Supper right before this. You have Judas's betrayal right after. You have Peter's denial. You have the death, the burial, and the resurrection, the trial, the scourging, all this stuff associated with this little passage in between about Jesus in the garden. And it's surrounded by so much that we never really look at it in isolation. We always compare it with everything else that's going on around at this time. And we always look at it in following verses and following chapters. But do we really understand what's going on here in the garden in isolation, and what Jesus is wrestling with, and what he is trying to accept? Matthew 26, verse 36 through 46 says this. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and began to be grieved and distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me." And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you." And he came to his disciples and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, "So men, could you not keep watch with me for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying that you will not enter into temptation. And the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away again a second time and prayed, saying, "My Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done." Again he came and found them sleeping, and their eyes were heavy. And he left them again and went away and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand." It's fascinating how the roles reverse here. The apostles are the ones that finally accept what Jesus is going to do. And Jesus himself is wrestling with it. He's struggling in this garden. And he's really wrestling with his fate. You think about it. The Passover is at hand. The sacrifice is coming up. They just instituted the Lord's Supper, and they know Jesus is that ultimate sacrificial lamb. The imagery is all there. They're Jews. They know what's about to take place. And they know through Jesus' ministry and his teaching that he is going to be the one to be sacrificed. And yet here in the garden we see this little reversal of them, the apostles accepting it and Jesus not. And you're like, well, how did the apostles accept it? They just fell asleep. You know, it was late. They were praying. Their eyes were probably closed. Sleep would have been easy to succumb to, right? Well, I want you to think if your child was missing, or your spouse was injured in an accident in another state and you couldn't be there, or your brother or your sister, or your mom or your dad, how easily would sleep come to you? Would you be praying for them? Would your eyes be closed? But would you fall asleep in that situation, in heightened stress, in heightened awareness? Most likely not. And any sleep you got would be restless. And yet here the apostles fell asleep. So clearly they had come to accept this, because what they were experiencing would have been just as difficult as the situation I just described for you to fall asleep in. And yet they fell asleep. So it's almost like they've come to this acceptance of what Jesus is about to do. And yet here we see Jesus struggling with it. You see Jesus really grappling and wrestling with this acceptance of his cup, of this cup that he has to drink, of what he's going to do. In Matthew 26, verse 39, it says, "And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, 'My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you.'" Here he's still pleading to remove it. I don't want to drink it. I don't want to do it. Take it from me. That's not really accepting it. That's counterintuitive to everything he's been preaching up until this point. If you look at Luke's version in 22 verse 44, it talks about Jesus sweating blood, a condition doctors call hematohydrosis, which is where you're so stressed that your blood vessels in your brain swell to the point where they seep into the sweat glands and blood comes out your sweat glands rather than sweat. That doesn't sound like someone who's just sat back and accepted his fate and knew what he was going to do. It sounds like someone who's struggling with this, who's wrestling with it, who doesn't want to drink it. We look a little bit further on in verse 42. And he went away again a second time and prayed, saying, My Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done. If this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done. So again, we see that negative connotation of the language of what he's saying. It cannot pass away. Father, I must do this. I will for you. So we see that grappling with that acceptance. We always think of it as like he willingly, 100%, everything in mind, just boom, boom, boom. It was what he was supposed to do. He knew what he had to do. He was going to do it. But here we see, if I have to, I will, Father, for you. I know what's at stake, but it's hard. Why was it so hard for him to accept it? Was it his death? The torture, agony, and pain? The shame and humiliation? The abandonment by his followers? What was it? I believe it was sin. It was the realization that Jesus was about to bear the sins of every individual ever. Of those who beat him, who mocked him, who spit on him, who killed him, for those who refuse to listen to him, and those who follow him. It's for every sin you willingly commit and every sin you incidentally commit. And I think that's what made it so difficult. It's difficult for you and I to accept our sin. It's difficult for us to accept the sin of others. Because I want us to grow and I want us to get deeper in our understanding and our faith. Castle Rock's vision talked about belong, and this year we're focusing on become. And if we are to become like Jesus, we need to help others belong. We need to help people feel accepted. We've all heard the phrase, love the sinner, but hate the sin. And it sounds great, it sounds wonderful. But what does it look like? Do we really mean it when it becomes difficult? And will we wrestle with it like Jesus did in the garden? Now I have a question for you. I want you to honestly sit back and reflect on this. If a practicing homosexual couple came into this building to worship with us this morning and sat down next to you, could you accept them? Could you love them like Jesus? Could you be there and talk to that individual, embrace that individual? Honestly, could you do it? And I don't want to hear, well, I love them enough, I'll rebuke them and tell them they're living in sin because I'm concerned for their soul. This is not an opportune time for that conversation. You don't know them. You just met them. You have no right in love or any other motive to bring up that conversation. So could you just accept them? And the reality is, it's difficult. It's truly difficult to love the sinner and hate the sin because we have a hard time separating the two. And I bet you it would feel a little bit like Jesus wrestling with it in the garden. Religion doesn't want to accept them. It doesn't want to accept people for who they are. It wants to clean them up and get their act together first. It wants someone to gather out their sin rather than loving them in spite of their sin. But Jesus accepts them. He accepts you for your sin, and he accepts me for my sin. Jesus knew our sins. He knew our struggles. He knew our situation, and yet still loved us enough to go to the cross and take it with him because he accepts us. And it is once we truly recognize and understand that he accepts us no matter what, that we are transformed, that we are changed, that we are made better in his image because of the change in our heart and the change in relationship we have with him. We are human beings, not human doings. God's love is not contingent on what we do. We all sin and fall short of the glory. God accepted us with our sin and is working on us. He can accept others and their sin and work on them too. And God's acceptance is like a party invitation. The offer is on the table for you. If you are willing to accept Jesus and have an opportunity to embrace him, if you will believe and confess in his name that he is your Lord and Savior, be baptized into his death, and be raised to walk in a new life, you have that opportunity to respond to his acceptance as we stand and as we sing.
I'm in the way, the